Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my tier list of the bosses in Mythic Eternal Palace, based on how fun I thought they were to progress on. And I'm going to weight the bosses based on where they occurred in the dungeon, so I'm going to be more generous towards bosses earlier in the raid, and how good I thought they were at being early bosses in a raid, and a little bit more demanding of the end bosses, because those are the ones that we're really hoping to have a lot of fun and exciting mechanics on, and the ones that we spend most of our time in the raid fighting. I'm not going to place any Eternal Palace bosses in the F tier here. I'm going to save the F tier for bosses that are like unplayably awful on progression, bosses that are bugged for a long time when I'm fighting them, and that sort of thing. And that wasn't true of anything that I played up against in Eternal Palace. I think it's possible that you could make an argument that Ajara, for instance, would have been F tier if I had reached it 3 weeks before I did and was dealing with it. The version that people who were fighting for World First started progressing on. That looked like an especially awful experience, but by the time I reached Ajara, most of the worst parts of the fight had been nerfed at least a little bit, and that, I think, earned it all the way up into the D tier. So Ajara, a boss that I'm not very happy with. There was a lot of unfun mechanics on this boss fight, not to mention just a huge dungeon journal with a bunch of abilities, and a lot of them were not very fun to play with. One of the big mechanics of this fight was like abusing line of sight and getting out of line of sight of things, and there were like these finicky line of sight moments where it was really not clear like where exactly the line of sight that you needed to be was. The boss model is like massive, and the line of sight really was not an engaging experience to be lining this boss and, you know, lining the spears as they break through the crystalline shields and all those sorts of things. I felt like the decree mechanic was pretty interesting in the intermission, but it was pretty quickly, everybody was just using a weak aura for it, and that stopped making it really all that interesting. And I think that it's tough to imagine a way that they could have designed that mechanic so that it wouldn't have been, you know, immediately done with weak auras. But if there was a way to do that, I think it would have been pretty fun to actually figure out on the fly how to do that intermission instead of just, you know, grouping up and then doing what the weak aura told you. But all in all, a pretty disappointing end boss fight coming off the heels of Unot, which I felt was one of the best end boss fights they've ever made. All right, up next in the D tier, Radiance of Ajara. This fight was not very innovative as far as I could tell. There were a lot of mechanics just copied from the Eye of Ajara, Wrath of Ajara boss fight, which does make sense thematically, right? It's a similar kind of construct that Ajara has created here. But one thing that I really had a problem with on this fight was that the Mythic version of the fight had no new mechanics. Like, the only difference was stuff hits harder, and there's 2 adds instead of 1 in the intermission phases, and outside of that, you actually could not, like, you could show me a clip of a 20-person heroic group doing the fight, and a clip of a 20-person mythic group doing the fight, and it would be kind of hard to tell which fight was which, like, until we got to that animation and saw the 2 ads spawning. There's not really an easy way to see what exactly makes it a mythic fight, and that felt pretty disappointing, fighting against it in the Mythic Eternal Palace. I'm also going to place Zakul in the D tier. And one thing that I think makes this particular raid look pretty bad is the fact that both the end boss and the second to last boss are ones that I rate so poorly. For me in particular, those are the bosses that it's most important to be good, and I can forgive a lot more offenses on fights like Radiance of Ajara because I don't really care too much about those, but I do care a lot about how good the end boss and the second to last boss are. And one thing that Zakul had a lot of interesting mechanics, theoretically, but in practice, on progression, the strategy that most guilds used that were killing it before and around the time that my guild did there was this like DPS stop thing that we had to, multiple times throughout the fight, we had to stop damage to make sure that we were going to get good overlaps for the rest of the fight. And that I think is a really obnoxious thing to have as part of a fight. We would just have this phase 1, and phase 1, we could push through it in like 50 seconds, but we needed to wait an extra like an extra 30 seconds because otherwise we would start seeing bad overlaps later. So those bosses where there's like these spell queue timers that aren't reset at the start of a phase, I think it's a really big drawback when it incentivizes us to stop damage. Queen Ajara, a little bit like that as well. There are also moments in that fight where you're going to want to stop damage, but there it's at least a little bit more reasonable and a much shorter amount of time. For Zakul progression, I think on the fight where we pulled it, I was playing an Elemental Shaman, and for the first minute of the fight, I was just in my Raptor form, auto-attacking the boss, not doing anything else, because they're like me doing damage to the boss would be actively bad, and we just wanted our melee people to be doing damage to the boss so they could at least be building up ink pod stacks, and we were just stopping damage so early in the fight by that time. So all in all, that is actually the biggest problem I had with the Zakul. The rest of it, the one-shottiness of the Dread Dispel mechanic, the fact that it relied so heavily on damage reduction cooldowns to beat that, I didn't have such a huge problem with. One problem I did have with the fight was that a lot of your wipes on progression would be to the people in the Delirium Realm messing their job up, because the Delirium Realm was a very hard job. So a lot of the time you'd have these pulls where 17 of the 20 people in your raid aren't learning anything new, aren't having anything interesting, and just one of the 3 people in the Delirium Realm dies, and you're just like, okay, you know, wipe it. Or one of the 4 people in the Delirium Realm, depending on which phase you're in. And for most of the raid, those aren't wipes where you've learned something, and that is, I think, another big drawback to this fight. I'm not going to place any bosses in the C tier this raid. I'm going to jump all the way up to the B tier, where I'm going to place Lady Ashebane. Lady Ashebane was a huge wall as the 4th boss in the raid, a huge step up in difficulty from the first 3, and I actually kind of like raids like this where there is a wall boss that is a huge step up in difficulty, and it kind of separates the, you know, easy bosses from the rest of the raid. As far as the actual Ashebane fight is concerned, I liked the fact that there were multiple different strategies for it that worked. You could 3-tank it, you could 2-tank it, you could try and 2-phase it, which didn't really work too well early on in progression, but started being a strategy pretty quick. Or you could try and 3-phase it. You could play multiple different amounts of healers, and you could use your cooldowns at different times as well. You could Bloodlust and try and push through one of the, you know, upstairs phases to get reduced damage on your raid and reduced Rippling Wave casts, or you could save your lust for the down phases and try and push the boss in as few of those as possible. I liked those kinds of decisions, and I liked how many different ways there were to deal, you know, do you want a tank soaking all the waterlogged stacks and then just pumping healing into them? In fact, maybe you even want a tank who dies intentionally, gets B-rezzed, soaks another wave, and then dies again. Or do you want all your DPS to kind of spread out those waterlogged stacks? And I felt like there were a lot of different options for different guilds to come up with different solutions to this based on their composition and just based on what they thought was best. And there wasn't a clear right answer a lot of the time. And a lot of the time, the right answer changed as the group got more geared, which was pretty cool. So all in all, I think a pretty good boss fight. Also in the B tier, I'm going to place Blackwater Behemoth. Blackwater Behemoth was a boss that everybody was very worried about after PTR testing. You know, an underwater boss, a 3D Z-axis boss. Those are things that one always worries about when you hear Blizzard Entertainment and they're just like, yeah, we've got this great idea for something that's going to happen in 3 dimensions. Alarm bells should be going off in your brain because the World of Warcraft engine does not handle the Z-axis very well. And Blackwater Behemoth was an example of this. There are a lot of mechanics that just are buggy in a 3D environment. You know, you try to place a Rune of Power and you need to be doing it on the seafloor, otherwise it's not going to work. You try and place like a Spirit Link Totem or Darkness or whatever. You try and soak the Piercing Barb, and if you're doing that too high up in the water, it's just going to randomly bug out and behave weirdly. So all those things being considered, I think that Blizzard made a good faith effort here on this boss. I think it ended up turning out pretty good compared to what we were worried about on it. And one thing that I really like that Blizzard did is that they just made it so that it wasn't tuned very aggressively. And that's nice, right? Because if there's a tight DPS check and then something weird bugs out and you feel like you got, you know, this kill taken away from you because the boss fight was buggy, then that would, I think, be pretty bad. But they ended up in this balancing place on the fight where you could have a couple things bug out and still kill the boss, and I thought that was really nice. And I actually quite liked the mechanic of, like, needing to kill a fish to be healable. I thought, like, that was pretty interesting, and I felt like groups that had good forward knowledge of seeing their debuffs were about to fall off and killing the fish would then, you know, survive, whereas groups that didn't notice until it was too late would correctly get punished. And I felt like that was a pretty appropriate level of difficulty and a pretty good thing to test as far as a second or third boss of the raid goes. Orcazoa is the next boss I'm going to place in this B tier. Orcazoa is a boss that has some pretty cool mechanics going on for it. It's a fight that is, you know, there's this spread mechanic, there's a cool little dance, there's high overall damage, there's a DPS check, there's an HPS check, and there's a big tanking check on it too. The tanking check I felt like was one problem with it was just how friendly it was to Brewmasters and how hostile it was to other tanks. Brewmasters were basically the only tank that could 2-tank this fight because they had access to Black Ox statue, which facilitated swapping threat on all the little lads at once. And they were one of the only tanks that could realistically survive being hit by Orcazoa without stacks of desensitizing sting. So this is a fight that I feel like if that balancing concern didn't exist, if they found a way to make this fight not so Brewmaster-centric with its core mechanics. Brewmaster already, you know, a naturally good tank spec for raid. If you've seen some of my other tier list content on this channel, you'll heard me extolling its virtues, but this fight in particular really overplayed that, and I felt like that was kind of an annoying part of it as well, and it overplayed the importance of, like, healers with big AoE damage reduction cooldowns, which is another thing that was already tested in other parts of this raid. But other than that, I think that the fight was pretty good. I think that there was a lot of difficulty with this fight and a lot of interesting difficulty. There was a cool little gauntlet that you had to run, which was a little buggy, but as far as gauntlets to run, in the middle of a boss fight go, I think it was a pretty fun little experience. Trying to not get knocked off there, which, no comments about if that ever happened to me, but it definitely happened to some people, poor people falling off the edge while they were running to get to the second phase part of that fight. All in all, one that I had quite a lot of fun with, and I think was fairly well designed, with just a couple of, exacerbating class balance issues was the main flaw, I'd say, with this fight. All the way up in the A tier now, we have Abyssal Commander Savara. Abyssal Commander Savara is the first boss of the raid, and I think that as far as first bosses go, this was a fantastic one. It was a real, mythic level fight as early as the first boss of the raid, and that's not something that we often see. Often we see these raids where there's a mythic first boss like Champions of the Light, which just falls over dead to, any 20 people with a pulse. And Abyssal Commander Savara was not that. There's a realistic healing check here. There's mechanics that need to be executed. If your whole raid messes up during the barrage and everybody, clears their stacks at once, you're gonna die. You're gonna wipe that. There was a serious DPS check for at least the first couple of weeks for many guilds on this fight. And all in all, I thought that was a really great place for the first boss to land. If anything, maybe it was even a little too hard, but as for first bosses, because the next two bosses were probably easier than that. But honestly, I like it when the first boss of the raid is a real, welcome to Mythic. This is what a Mythic fight is like. And one big upside of that as well, compared to Battle of Dazar'alor, is nowadays, if you're going into Eternal Palace and you want to do a Mythic run on your alt, if your group can't kill Savara, you're not locked, right? And you can try to find a different group. Whereas back in the good old days, in Battle of Dazar'alor or whatever, if you wanted loot from Grong, and you just would find this raid, you'd easily roll through Champions of the Light, you'd get saved on that character, and you wouldn't be able to kill Grong, and you would have no chance of getting that loot. Nowadays, if you want loot from Radiance of Ajara, or from Blackwater Behemoth, you can just wait until you find a group that kills Savara, and then that group is almost guaranteed to be able to kill those next two bosses. And I think that's a really nice place to land as well, for that little reason. Alright, the final boss on this tier list, not quite making it up to the S tier, is the Queen's Court, also going into my A tier. I had a lot of fun on this fight. This was one of my favorite kinds of fight. There's basically no randomness in this fight. There's who gets targeted with the charge is really the biggest piece of randomness in this fight. But outside of this, it's just there's a set of mechanics, and then there's these edicts that change throughout the room and force you to move around the room in a circle, and also change what each of the base abilities of the bosses does, right? So frenetic charge takes on a whole different meaning when you can't stack for it. And because of that, it created this cool dance where every minute of the fight in progression, we would find a new overlap and we'd wipe to it, and then we'd be like, okay, how are we supposed to deal with this thing? And that, I think, is an awesome place for a fight to be. I really love fights like that. I much prefer them to the kind of spell queuing fights like Jaina, where instead of having a preset overlap that always happens every time you pull the boss, fights like Jaina instead were okay, there's 7 different patterns, and you sort of have to memorize all of them, and then also you're only likely to kill the boss on a couple of these patterns because they're a lot easier than the others. So Queen's Court, lovely fight. I liked that it was not RNG dependent. It is a little bit ranged heavy, so that the fact that it was so hostile to melee, I don't know, it's hard to design good boss fights that aren't hostile to melee. Just many mechanics are off the table if you want to make them so that they're melee-friendly fights, but some fights have done that in the past successfully, and Queen's Court is not one of them. Queen's Court is a fight where you hugely benefit by being a mostly ranged-centric comp, and that, I think, is one thing that's holding it back from being an S-tier encounter. But it is, I'd say, the fight that I had the most fun with in Eternal Palace, and my favorite boss fight of the tier. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little look into my thought process as far as Mythic bosses go. Let me know what you thought of this video. Obviously, it's a little different than my previous tier list videos because it's just, my subjective opinion on the game design of the game. And definitely let me know where you disagree in the comments. Of course, my perspective is going to be different than yours. I probably reached these bosses at a different time than you did, so you may have had a completely different experience as you reached them with either more or less gear than me, and maybe in a different state. They may have been either nerfed before or after I got there relative to you. So you may have had a different experience, but this was just how I felt on progression with these bosses. If you'd like this content, let me know and I can make more like it. Or if you'd like me to just go back to talking about which specs are good, I can do that too. Anyways, remember to like and subscribe. Thanks everybody for watching. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos, and I'll see you in the next one.